The Maryland Campaign, or Antietam Campaign, occurred September 4–20, 1862, during the American Civil War. Confederate Gen. Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North was repulsed by the Army of the Potomac under Maj. Gen. George B. McClellan, who moved to intercept Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia and eventually attacked it near Sharpsburg, Maryland. The resulting Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single-day battle in American history and is widely considered one of the major turning points of the war. His objective was to resupply his army outside of the war-torn Virginia theater and to damage Northern morale in anticipation of the November elections. He undertook the risky maneuver of splitting his army so that he could continue north into Maryland while simultaneously capturing the Federal garrison and arsenal at Harper's Ferry. McClellan accidentally found a copy of Lee's orders to his subordinate commanders and planned to isolate and defeat the separated portions of Lee's army, while Confederate Maj. Gen. Stonewall Jackson surrounded, bombarded, and captured Harper's Ferry. McClellan's army of 84,000 men attempted to move quickly through the South Mountain passes that separated him from Lee. The Battle of South Mountain on September 14 delayed McClellan's advance and allowed Lee sufficient time to concentrate most of his army at Sharpsburg. The Battle of Antietam on September 17 was the bloodiest day in American military history, with over 22,000 casualties. Lee, outnumbered 2–1, moved his defensive forces to parry each offensive blow, but McClellan never deployed all of the reserves of his army to capitalize on localized successes and destroy the Confederates. On September 18, Lee ordered a withdrawal across the Potomac, and on September 1920, fights by Lee's rear guard at Shepherdstown ended the campaign. Although Antietam was a tactical draw, Lee's Maryland campaign failed to achieve its objectives. President Abraham Lincoln used this Union victory as the justification for announcing his Emancipation Proclamation, which effectively ended any threat of European support for the Confederacy. Background: the year 1862 started out well for Union forces in the Eastern Theater. George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac had invaded the Virginia Peninsula during the Peninsular Campaign and by June stood only a few miles outside the Confederate capital at Richmond. But when Robert E. Lee assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia on June 1, 1862, fortunes reversed. Lee fought McClellan aggressively in the 7 days' battles. McClellan lost his nerve, and his army retreated down the peninsula. Lee then conducted the Northern Virginia campaign, in which he outmaneuvered and defeated Maj. Gen. John Pope and his Army of Virginia, most significantly at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Lee's Maryland campaign can be considered the concluding part of a logically connected, three-campaign, summer offensive against Federal forces in the Eastern Theater. The Confederates had suffered significant manpower losses in the wake of the summer campaigns. Nevertheless, Lee decided his army was ready for a great challenge, an invasion of the North. His goal was to reach the major northern states of Maryland and Pennsylvania, and cut off the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad line that supplied Washington, D.C. His movements would threaten Washington and Baltimore, so as to annoy and harass the enemy. Several motives led to Lee's decision to launch an invasion. First, he needed to supply his army and knew the farms of the North had been untouched by war, unlike those in Virginia. Moving the war northward would relieve pressure on Virginia. Second was the issue of Northern morale. Lee knew the Confederacy did not have to win the war by defeating the North militarily. It merely needed to make the Northern populace and government unwilling to continue the fight. With the congressional elections of 1862 approaching in November, Lee believed that an invading army playing havoc inside the North could tip the balance of Congress to the Democratic Party, which might force Abraham Lincoln to negotiate an end to the war. He told Confederate President Jefferson Davis in a letter of September 3 that the enemy was much weakened and demoralized. There were secondary reasons as well. The Confederate invasion might be able to incite an uprising in Maryland, especially given that it was a slaveholding state and many of its citizens held a sympathetic stance toward the South. Some Confederate politicians, including Jefferson Davis, believed the prospect of foreign recognition for the Confederacy would be made stronger by a military victory on Northern soil. But there is no evidence that Lee thought the South should base its military plans on this possibility. Nevertheless, the news of the victory at Second Bull Run and the start of Lee's invasion caused considerable diplomatic activity between the Confederate States and France and the United Kingdom. After the defeat of Pope at Second Bull Run, President Lincoln reluctantly returned to the man who had mended a broken army before, George B. McClellan. After the Union defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run, he knew that McClellan was a strong organizer and a skilled trainer of troops, able to recombine the units of Pope's army with the Army of the Potomac faster than anyone. On September 2, 1862, Lincoln named McClellan to command the fortifications of Washington and all the troops for the defense of the capital. The appointment was controversial in the cabinet, a majority of whom signed a petition declaring to the President our deliberate opinion that, at this time, it is not safe to entrust to Major General McClellan the command of any army of the United States. The President admitted that it was like curing the bite with the hair of the dog, but Lincoln told his secretary, John Hay, "We must use what tools we have. There is no man in the army who can man these fortifications and lick these troops of ours into shape half as well as he. If he can't fight himself, he excels in making others ready to fight opposing forces." Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was organized into two large infantry corps, about 55,000 effectives at the beginning of September. The First Corps, under Maj. Gen. James Longstreet, consisted of the divisions of Maj. Gen. Lafayette McLaws, Maj. Gen. Richard H. Anderson, Brig. Gen. David R. Jones, Brig. Gen. John G. Walker, Brig. Gen. John Bellhood, and an independent brigade under Brig. Gen. Nathan G. Shanks Evans. The Second Corps, under Maj. Gen. Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, consisted of the divisions of Brig. Gen. Alexander R. Lawton, Maj. Gen. A.P. Hill, Brig. Gen. John R. Jones, and Maj. Gen. D.H. Hill. The remaining units were the Cavalry Corps, under Maj. Gen. J.E.B. Stewart, and the Reserve Artillery, commanded by Brig. Gen. William N. Pendleton. The Second Corps was organized with artillery attached to each division, in contrast to the First Corps, which reserved its artillery at the corps level. Union Maj. Gen. George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac, bolstered by units absorbed from John Pope's Army of Virginia, included 6 infantry corps, about 84,000 men. The First Corps, under Maj. Gen. Joseph Hooker, consisted of the divisions of Brig. Gens. Rufus King, James B. Ricketts, and George G. Meade. The Second Corps, under Maj. Gen. Edwin V. Sumner, consisted of the divisions of Maj. Gens. Israel B. Richardson and John Sedgwick, and Brig. Gen. William H. French. The Fifth Corps, under Maj. Gen. Fitz John Porter, consisted of the divisions of Maj. Gen. George W. Morrell, Brig. Gen. George Sykes, and Brig. Gen. Andrew A. Humphreys. The Sixth Corps, under Maj. Gen. William B. Franklin, consisted of the divisions of Maj. Gens. Henry W. Slocum and William F. Baldy Smith, and a division from the Fourth Corps under Maj. Gen. Darius N. Couch. The Ninth Corps, under Maj. Gen. Ambrose E. Burnside, consisted of the divisions of Brig. Gens. Orlando B. Wilcox, Samuel D. Sturgis, and Isaac P. Rodman, and the Connaught Division, under Brig. Gen. Jacob D. Cox. The 12th Corps, under Maj. Gen. Joseph K. Mansfield, consisted of the divisions of Brig. Gens. Alpheus S. Williams and George S. Green, and the cavalry division of Brig. Gen. Alfred Pleasanton. During the march north into Maryland, McClellan changed his army's command structure, appointing commanders for 3 wings. The left, commanded by William B. Franklin, consisted of his own 6th Corps plus the division of Darius Couch. The center, under Edwin Sumner, consisted of his 2nd Corps and the 12th Corps. The right, under Ambrose Burnside, consisted of his 9th Corps and the 1st Corps. This wing organization was revoked just before the start of the Battle of Antietam. Initial movements. On September 3, just 2 days after the Battle of Chantilly, Lee wrote to President Davis that he had decided to cross into Maryland unless the president objected. On the same day, Lee began shifting his army north and west from Chantilly towards Leesburg, Virginia. On September 4, advance elements of the Army of Northern Virginia crossed into Maryland from Loudoun County. The main body of the army advanced into Frederick, Maryland, on September 7. The 55,000-man army had been reinforced by troops who had been defending Richmond. The divisions of Maj. Gens. D.H. Hill and Lafayette McLaws and 2 brigades under Brig. Gen. John G. Walker, but they merely made up for the 9,000 men lost at Bull Run and Chantilly. Lee's invasion coincided with another strategic offensive by the Confederacy. Generals Braxton Bragg and Edmund Kirkby Smith had simultaneously launched invasions of Kentucky. Jefferson Davis sent to all 3 generals a draft public proclamation, with blank spaces available for them to insert the name of whatever state their invading forces might reach. Davis wrote to explain to the public why the South seemed to be changing its strategy. Until this point, the Confederacy had claimed it was the victim of aggression and was merely defending itself against foreign invasion. Davis explained that the Confederacy was still waging a war of self-defense. He wrote there was no design of conquest, and that the invasions were only an aggressive effort to force the Lincoln government to let the South go. In peace, we are driven to protect our own country by transferring the seat of war to that of an enemy who pursues us with relentless and apparently aimless hostility. Davis's draft proclamation did not reach his generals until after they had issued proclamations of their own. They stressed that they had come as liberators, not conquerors, to these border states. But they did not address the larger issue of the Confederate strategy shift as Davis had desired. Lee's proclamation announced to the people of Maryland that his army had come, with the deepest sympathy, for the wrongs that have been inflicted upon the citizens of the Commonwealth allied to the states of the South by the strongest social, political, and commercial ties, to aid you in throwing off this foreign yoke, to enable you again to enjoy the inalienable rights of freemen. Dividing Lee's army. Lee divided his army into 4 parts as it moved into Maryland. After receiving intelligence of militia activity in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, Lee sent Maj. Gen. James Longstreet to Boonesborough and then to Hagerstown. Maj. Gen. Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson was ordered to seize the Union arsenal at Harper's Ferry with 3 separate columns. This left only the thinly spread cavalry of Maj. Gen. J.E.B. Stuart and the division of Maj. Gen. D.H. Hill to guard the army's rear at South Mountain. The specific reason Lee chose this risky strategy of splitting his army to capture Harper's Ferry is not known. One possibility is that he knew it commanded his supply lines through the Shenandoah Valley. Before he entered Maryland, he had assumed that the Federal garrisons at Winchester, Martinsburg, and Harper's Ferry would be cut off and abandoned without firing a shot. Another possibility is that it was simply a tempting target with many vital supplies but virtually indefensible. McClellan requested permission from Washington to evacuate Harper's Ferry and attach its garrison to his army, but his request was refused. Reactions to invasion. Lee's invasion was fraught with difficulties from the beginning. The Confederate Army's numerical strength suffered in the wake of straggling and desertion. Although he started from Chantilly with 55,000 men, within 10 days this number had diminished to 45,000. Some troops refused to cross the Potomac River because an invasion of Union territory violated their beliefs that they were fighting only to defend their states from Northern aggression. Countless others became ill with diarrhea after eating unripe green corn from the Maryland fields, or fell out because their shoeless feet were bloodied on hard-surface Northern roads. Lee ordered his commanders to deal harshly with stragglers, whom he considered cowards, who desert their comrades in peril, and were therefore unworthy members of an army that has immortalized itself in its recent campaigns. Upon entering Maryland, the Confederates found little support. Rather, they were met with reactions that ranged from a cool lack of enthusiasm to, in most cases, open hostility. Robert E. Lee was disappointed at the state's resistance, a condition that he had not anticipated. Although Maryland was a slaveholding state, Confederate sympathies were considerably less pronounced among the lower and middle classes, which generally supported the Union cause, than among the pro-secession legislature, the majority of whom hailed from southern Maryland, an area almost entirely economically dependent on slave labor. Furthermore, many of the fiercely pro-Southern Marylanders had already traveled south at the beginning of the war to join the Confederate Army in Virginia. Only a few score of men joined Lee's columns in Maryland. Maryland and Pennsylvania, alarmed and outraged by the invasion, rose at once to arms. Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin called for 50,000 militia to turn out, and he nominated Gen. John F. Reynolds, a native Pennsylvanian, to command him. As far north as Wilkes-Barre, church and courthouse bells rang out, calling men to drill. In Maryland, panic was much more widespread than in Pennsylvania, which was not yet immediately threatened. Baltimore, which Lee incorrectly regarded as a hotbed of secession merely waiting for the appearance of Confederate armies to revolt, took up the war call against him immediately. When it was learned in Baltimore that Southern armies had crossed the Potomac, the reaction was one of instantaneous hysteria, followed quickly by stoic resolution. Crowds milled in the street outside newspaper offices waiting for the latest bulletins, and the sale of liquor was halted to restrain the excitable. The public stocked up on food and other essentials, fearing a siege. Philadelphia was also sent into a flurry of frenzied preparations, despite being over 150 miles from Hagerstown and in no immediate danger. McClellan's pursuit. I did not believe before coming here that there was so much Union feeling in the state. The whole population of Frederick seemed to turn out to welcome us. When Gen. McClellan came through, the ladies nearly ate him up. They kissed his clothing, threw their arms around his horse's neck, and committed all sorts of extravagances. Gen. John Gibbon McClellan moved out of Washington starting on September 7 with his 87,000-man army in a lethargic pursuit. He was a naturally cautious general and assumed he would be facing over 120,000 Confederates. He also was maintaining running arguments with the government in Washington, demanding that the forces defending the capital city report to him. The army started with relatively low morale, a consequence of its defeats on the peninsula and at Second Bull Run, but upon crossing into Maryland, their spirits were boosted by the friendly, almost tumultuous welcome that they received from the citizens of the state. The Army of the Potomac reached Frederick, Maryland, on September 13. There, CPL. Barton Mitchell of the 27th Indiana Infantry discovered a mislaid copy of the detailed campaign plans of Lee's army, Special Order 191, wrapped around 3 cigars. The order indicated that Lee had divided his army and dispersed portions geographically, thus making each subject to isolation and defeat in detail. Upon realizing the intelligence value of this discovery, McClellan threw up his arms and exclaimed, "Now I know what to do." He waved the order at his old army friend, Brig. Gen. John Gibbon, and said, "Here is a paper with which if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." He telegraphed President Lincoln, "I have the whole rebel force in front of me, but I am confident, and no time shall be lost. I think Lee has made a gross mistake, and that he will be severely punished for it. I have all the plans of the rebels, and will catch them in their own trap if my men are equal to the emergency. We'll send you trophies." McClellan waited 18 hours before deciding to take advantage of this intelligence. His delay squandered the opportunity to destroy Lee's army. On the night of September 13, the Army of the Potomac moved toward South Mountain, with Burnside's right wing of the army directed to Turner's Gap, and Franklin's left wing to Crampton's Gap. South Mountain is the name given to the continuation of the Blue Ridge Mountains after they enter Maryland. It is a natural obstacle that separates the Shenandoah Valley and Cumberland Valley from the eastern part of Maryland. Crossing the passes of South Mountain was the only way to reach Lee's army. Lee, seeing McClellan's uncharacteristic aggressive actions, and possibly learning through a Confederate sympathizer that his order had been compromised, quickly moved to concentrate his army. He chose not to abandon his invasion and return to Virginia yet, because Jackson had not completed the capture of Harper's Ferry. Instead, he chose to make a stand at Sharpsburg, Maryland. In the meantime, elements of the Army of Northern Virginia waited in defense of the passes of South Mountain. Although he was being pursued at a leisurely pace by Maj. Gen. George B. McClellan and the Union Army of the Potomac, outnumbering him more than 2-1, Lee chose the risky strategy of dividing his army to seize the prize of Harper's Ferry. While the corps of Maj. Gen. James Longstreet drove north in the direction of Hagerstown, Lee sent columns of troops to converge and attack Harper's Ferry from 3 directions. The largest column, 11,500 men under Jackson, was to recross the Potomac in circle around to the west of Harper's Ferry and attack it from Bolivar Heights, while the other 2 columns, under Maj. Gen. Lafayette McLaws and Brig. Gen. John G. Walker, were to capture Maryland Heights and Loudoun Heights, commanding the town from the east and south.